Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Jiyae Hwang. I am a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about the TN visa requirements. And as many of you may know, the TN visa is available to citizens of Canada or Mexico and allows many types of professionals to obtain work authorization in the United States in a streamlined way. So just a few things before we get started. Scott Legal is a full-service immigration law firm, which means we have expertise handling a wide variety of visa categories suited for various circumstances. So whatever your immigration needs may be it a family-based, employment-based, or investment-based immigration matter, we can help you find a solution. We will be continuing these webinar series, doing at least 2 webinars a month on different immigration law topics. At the end of this webinar, we will send out a few things to all participants. First, we will send you a copy of the PowerPoint that has all the information that will be covered in this webinar. Second, we will send you a comprehensive TN visa guide, a PDF document that you can use as a reference. It will contain a lot of useful information for you. We will also send you a link where you can sign up for additional webinars that are coming up in the future, and also a link to this webinar as it will be recorded. This webinar will also be made available on YouTube, and we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel as we regularly upload a variety of videos on different immigration law topics. Finally, we will also send you a link where you can follow to set up a consultations with one of our experienced attorneys should you wish to discuss your matter further. So today we are very lucky to have Dustin Saldarriaga, who is a senior associate at Scott Legal with a wealth of experience handling a wide variety of TN visa cases. He will be presenting about the requirements and various considerations around the TN visa. And finally, for any questions you may have, please feel free to add them to the Q&A function or the chat box, and we will try and get to all questions. Okay, so without further delay, I will hand it over to Dustin.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jiyae. So today we're going to be talking about the TN visa and the requirements. So we'll start by going through the fundamentals of the TN. Now, the first thing to understand about the TN visa is that it is rooted in the NAFTA treaty, which is between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So you do need to be a citizen of Canada or Mexico to receive a TN visa. And that just means that you have a passport from Canada or Mexico. It's fine to be a dual citizen. You just need to use that Canadian or Mexican passport when you apply for the TN visa. You also must be coming to the US to work in a profession that's actually listed in the TN regulations. So I'll be referring to the TN regulations throughout this presentation. So if you are sitting at your computer, if you go ahead and Google TN NAFTA, N-A-F-T-A, regulations, then you'll see the TN regulations on your screen. And you'll see one of the first things you'll see is a list of professions, starting with accountant, then architect, computer systems analyst, et cetera, et cetera. You do need to be coming to the US to work in one of those listed professions. You also must meet the required qualifications for the listed profession. So for example, if we look at accountant, we see baccalaureate or licenciatura degree, or CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA, which is the professional license. So basically, if you're coming to the US to work as an accountant, you either need a degree in accounting or you need a professional license in accounting. If we go down to economist, you see that you need to have a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. So you can't satisfy the economist category through some kind of a professional license. You actually do need a degree. If you go down to management consultant, you'll see you can apply based on a degree or equivalent professional experience. So management consultant is one of the few categories where you actually don't need a degree or a professional license to apply for the category. But the real takeaway at this point is you first define what profession you're coming to the US to practice, and then you make sure that you meet the qualifications for that specific profession. You also need to have a prearranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the US. So basically, step one to get a TN visa is to talk with an employer in the US that wants to hire you. And you'd basically have a job offer from them. And they'd say, okay, we're willing to hire you as an accountant for a specific period of time to work as an accountant. And in your application, and we'll get into more detail on this, you'll actually say, what your job duties will be and how long you'll be performing the job. But the TN visa is not intended to come to the US to look for a job. So you really do already need to have that job offer lined up. Now, it's okay to come to the US, in another status and to have those conversations with an employer. For example, if you're in the US, if you're Canadian and you're visa exempt, and while you're here, you have a conversation with a company and they say, we'd love to hire you, it's okay to then apply for the TN after having that discussion. Or if you're in B1 status, it's okay to have that discussion in the US and then to apply for the TN. But you cannot apply for a TN to come to the US and look for the job. You actually need to have the job offer first. And in the job, so if you're coming to the US as an accountant, you actually need to be employed to engage in that profession's activities. In other words, you need to be coming to the US to actually do what the US government thinks your profession does. So just to take a quick example, how do you know what the US government thinks your job does? The second resource I'll share with you, the first was the TN regulations. The second is the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or the OOH, is a publication of the US Department of Labor, and it actually lists a variety of professions, hundreds if not thousands of professions, and actually lists the job duties that those professions do. So if we stick with our example of accountant, if we Google OOH, accountant, then the first result that should come up is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is a part of the Department of Labor. You click that, and then there's a tab that says what they do. So if you click what they do, what accountants do, and you see job duties. They examine financial statements, they compute taxes owed, prepare tax returns, inspect account books, organize, analyze, and maintain financial records, etc., etc. So you need to actually, if you're coming to the US in TN status as an accountant, you actually need to be doing these job duties that the government thinks an accountant does. So, and this would be true of any of the professions. So if you're coming to the US in TN status to work as a lawyer, you need to make sure you're doing the lawyer's job duties, or the economist's job duties if you're coming to work as an economist. Where people get into trouble is if, say, they are trying to come to the US to work in a job category that isn't listed as one of the professions. So let's say someone's coming to the US and they're an expert in marketing. There's really no good TN category for someone who works in marketing, but sometimes they'll try to fit that job under another profession. They might apply to come to the US as an economist, where really what they're doing is marketing. And you really need to be careful if you're doing that. And what you really need to make sure you're doing is, if you're coming to the US in the category, even if you're working in marketing, make sure that most of your job duties really do fall under the job duties that are listed by the government in your profession. If a minority of your job duties are outside of what's listed on the Occupational Outlook Handbook, that can be okay, but be ready to have that discussion. All right, so those are the basic requirements, and we'll talk about a number of those as we continue through the presentation. So what is sponsorship? This is actually probably the most common question we get, and it usually comes through the employer. And the reason is that employers and many applicants are familiar with sponsorship as it applies in other contexts. So say the H-1B, the L, or even a green card application. And oftentimes employers are required to fulfill a number of requirements that do not, I'll make it clear at the beginning, that do not apply to the TN. So the TN has actually extremely low requirements for the employer. But let's talk for a minute about what sponsorship usually means in the context of applying for a visa. Usually what sponsorship means, again, H-1B/L green card, not TN, means that the employer needs to pay a prevailing wage, which is usually almost always above the minimum wage. It also can mean that the employer needs to pay if the employee is let go. They need to pay for the employee to travel back home, back to their home country. It can mean that the employer not bench the employee, which means that they actually need to employ them and need to pay them. It can mean, that the employer tests the US labor market to make sure that there's not a US citizen or lawful permanent resident that's available to do the work. None of those requirements apply to the TN context. For the TN visa, we say that the TN actually does not require sponsorship. It doesn't require any of the things that we just listed. So what is required of the employer? Well, the employer actually needs to offer a legitimate job to the applicant. So if a prospective employee is telling the government, I have a US employer that wants to hire me as an accountant, that job needs to be legitimate. So meaning if they get the TN, you actually as the employer do intend to employ them. However, they are at will, which means that if it turns out that they are not a good fit for the job once they show up, they can be fired. It also means that the employee can quit. Those are the two sides of at-will employment. They can be fired, but they can also quit. You as the employer are not required to pay a prevailing wage. You are required to pay a minimum wage. Every employer has to comply with the federal minimum wage and any state or local minimum wage. But that's the same for any employer. It's not specific to the immigration context. Sometimes, to make for a strong TN application, we would say, the person should be paid what someone in that job category is typically paid. So, if you're hiring someone as a lawyer in the TN category, it is going to be a flag if you're paying them $30,000 or $40,000 a year, because that's a very low salary for a lawyer. So the government might ask, are you actually going to be working as a lawyer if you're being paid so little? But that's not, it's not actually a requirement that's set in stone, as it would be, say, in the H-1B context, where you actually need to pay a prevailing wage. Also, there's no requirement to test the US labor market. So, if say that an employer meets someone who's in the US working in H-1B status, for another employer, and this is what I was referring to before. If you're in the US in a legitimate status and you have a conversation with an employer and they say, I want to hire you as a TN, that's generally fine to do. You can, as a TN employer, make them a job offer. You don't have to first find out if they're US citizens or permanent residents available to do the job. You can just tell the Canadian or the Mexican national, get a TN and we'll employ you. So the TN really is a wonderful option for employers. And when we have conversations either with a national of Mexico or Canada, or with an employer that's interested in hiring people from Mexico or Canada, the TN visa is the first option we look at almost every time, just because it is such a streamlined process. And part of it is that sponsorship is not required of the employer. So one thing to talk about is that the process for applying is especially streamlined if you're a national of Canada. So nationals of Canada have the option of applying for a TN visa. And I call it a TN visa. Technically, it's not a visa for nationals of Canada because really it's the port of entry that basically grants them permission to enter. They don't actually need an actual visa stamp in their passport. But Canadians can get a TN visa at the port of entry. So US Customs and Border Protection has authority to admit Canadians at ports of entry, meaning land crossings and airports. So nationals of Canada can actually bring their application packet, and we'll talk about what that includes, with them to the airport or with them when they're driving across the border, and can get a TN visa, TN status, as soon as they enter the US. And that gives them the ability to work for the US employer immediately upon entry. So it's one of the fastest options to work in the US. You get an immediate decision. And it's very streamlined. It's typically a quite brief conversation with the border officer. So for Canadians, the TN visa is especially streamlined. Nationals of Mexico do need to apply for the TN visa at the consulate. So they can apply at any consulate in the world, but typically it would be at a consulate in Mexico. They would do that. We'll talk about the details of applying, but what's important to know at this point is that nationals of Mexico do actually need a visa. They need the actual stamp, the sticker in their passport before they enter. That does require usually an interview at the consulate. Now, Canadians do have the option to apply at a consulate. Almost always they would not. There's usually not a good reason for a Canadian to go through that process. It's almost always easier for them to apply at a port of entry. One of the situations where a Canadian would want to apply at a consulate is if they have a dependent, meaning a spouse or a child who's not a national of Canada. So again, Customs and Border Protection only has authority to admit nationals of Canada at ports of entry. So spouses of Canadian nationals must apply at a consulate. So sometimes a Canadian national will want to go to the consulate with their dependent and apply at the same time, and that's fine to do. We'll talk about these two different application processes a little later in the presentation. And finally, there is an option to apply from within the US. So as I said, nationals of Canada have the option to apply at a port of entry or at a consulate. Nationals of Mexico can apply at a consulate, cannot apply at a port of entry, but both nationals of Canada and Mexico, if they're physically inside the US, they can apply for TN status through USCIS. So again, you have to be physically inside the US to apply through USCIS, and that is called a change of status. So if you're already in the US, you'd already have some other status. Let's say you're here in B1 status, just visiting, or if you're a Canadian, you may be in visa exempt status, and you'd file an application with USCIS to change your status to TN status. The actual application packet looks a lot, is really the same, the substance of it, whether you apply at a consulate or USCIS. There's a slightly different form you'd file, but we'll talk a bit more about that later. So let's get into a few more details about the differences between Canadian and Mexican, the differences in applying between Canadian and Mexican nationals. I already talked about a lot of this. Canadians are the only ones that can apply at a port of entry, airports, or land crossings. Canadians, they would usually receive a visa or be admitted for a period of 3 years, and then you can travel freely between the US and, internationally. Once you've been admitted, that's not a problem. Usually CBP, when they see that you've got that initial TN stamp for a certain period of time, you can enter and exit, no problem. Again, if the spouse is not Canadian, they do need to go to the consulate. Spouses or children will be granted what is called TD status. So the D for dependent. They cannot work. They do not have work authorization, but they can enroll in school, which is a benefit. Nationals of Mexico must apply at a consulate. Their visa stamps. So this actually was recently changed. So nationals of Mexico actually can apply for a 48-month visa, and that you do have to pay a little bit extra for that, but for almost the vast majority of applicants, it's worth applying for the extended visa, so you don't have to go back to the consulate, in a shorter period of time. Now, there's a difference between being granted the visa and then actually entering the US. Um, the 4-year period that the visa is granted for is just the window of time within which you can enter the U.S. Each time you enter the US, you're granted a period of stay. In the past, nationals of Mexico would be granted a period of stay for 1 year. They can always request a longer period of stay. And if your employment period is for a longer period, say 3 years, it's oftentimes worthwhile to just ask the officer if you can be granted TN status for 3 years. And oftentimes they'll do that, especially if in the letter it says, we plan to employ this person for 3 years. You can oftentimes get status for 3 years when you enter. For nationals of Mexico, if you are applying for a renewal, the consulate will sometimes permit a streamlined process where you can apply through mail. You'll only find out if you're eligible for that once you submit the application to the consulate, which is called the DS-160. It's an online application. And then they'll sometimes send you instructions for the streamlined process. But that's not guaranteed. You really do have to apply and see if you qualify, and the consulate chooses you for that.
Okay, Dustin. So we have one question, very simple, that maybe you can answer. How much time does it take to change to TN status if somebody is already in the United States, already living in the United States and a Mexican citizen? How long does it take to change status to TN?
Yeah, so to change status, you'd apply through USCIS, and fortunately, USCIS offers a premium processing option, which basically means if you pay an additional fee, I believe for the TN it's $2,500, then they will decide your application within 2 weeks of submitting it. So that can be a huge benefit to changing your status. Excuse me, you can get a decision within 2 weeks of applying. If you choose not to apply through premium processing, it is very likely going to take several months for USCIS to decide your application. So a lot of our clients who are applying through USCIS would opt for that premium processing option.
Okay.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about difficult TN categories. So I mentioned before that you need to be coming to the US to work in one of the listed TN professions, starting with accountants through economists, hotel managers, management consultants, dentists. There are dozens of professions, and again, you can see them in the TN regulations. Some professions are more challenging than others, and one of the most challenging categories is management consultants. And the reason for this is that management consultants is one of the few categories, I think it's one of 2 categories, that doesn't actually require a college degree. So for those applicants who don't have a college degree, they oftentimes will fall into the management consultant category. So as a result, the government really does scrutinize these applications, since it does tend to be a catch-all category. Now, you can qualify. So, if you do have a degree in business or in management, this category actually may be a relatively easy one. It's not challenging for everyone. There really is a spectrum. So at the easier end of the spectrum is if you're applying in this category based on a degree in management, or if you're applying in this category having worked for a management consulting company like Bain, Boston Consulting Group, McKinsey, or any of the other management consulting companies. If you're applying to come to the US to work for one of those companies as a management consultant, this is a quite straightforward category. So when I say it's a challenging category, I'm not talking about those applicants. What I am talking about is if you're coming to the US to work for an employer that is not a management consulting company. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you receive a job offer from a company in the US that manufactures and sells solar panels, and you have extensive experience. Let's say you have a decade of experience in manufacturing solar panels and selling them. And this solar panel company wants you to come to the US basically to advise them on how to improve their manufacture and sale of solar panels. You could apply under the management consulting category. It would be considered a risky application. And the reason for that is the US employer is not a management consulting company. It is a solar panel company. Also, you're qualifying based on experience. Let's say you don't have a college degree, you're applying based on your experience with solar panels over the course of 10 years. So how do you strengthen that kind of an application? Full disclosure, we do handle a number of these applications. We have had significant success with them. Of course, that doesn't mean that, that will continue in the future. These are risky cases and there's risk that comes with these cases. So you do need to be aware of that. But point being, they are often approvable and there is a way to make them stronger cases. And one of the ways you do that is by really making it clear how your experience is aligned with the company's needs. So to continue with our example, our US employer, the solar panel company, would make it very clear what their challenge is. So maybe their challenge is that they really want to more effectively market their solar panels to a certain clientele, or maybe their need is their cost of manufacturing solar panels is just too high and they really need someone to reduce the cost of manufacturing these solar panels. That's part one of the application, a very clearly defined challenge that the company is facing. Part two of the application is very clearly showing how you as the applicant, your experience is really well aligned to address that challenge. So the challenge exists and you are the ideal person to address the challenge based on your experience. And you would really make that clear in the application. You would also want to make it very clear that this is a discrete challenge. In other words, you are not coming to the US to work for this company in what is usually a permanent role. You are instead coming to the US to work as a management consultant. So what a management consultant usually does is they're hired to drop in, look at a problem, advise on a problem, solve the problem, and then they're gone. They're not coming to the US to join as manager of marketing. And, this used to be a permanent role and may someday be a permanent role, but this, national of Canada or Mexico is coming to fill the marketing role. That's not what this is intended to do. You really need to show that you're addressing a discrete challenge that's finite in time. And in the application to say how long you think it'll take, or the employer would say how long they think it'll take to address the challenge. So these applications become riskier the longer the role will last. So we oftentimes would advise our clients not to apply for a 3-year TN visa if you are coming to work as a management consultant. Define the challenge, say how long it'll take, hopefully a year, hopefully not longer than 2 years, but in a year or 2 years, you are going to solve the problem and you're going to be gone. The other ways you can strengthen these applications is, again, making it look much more like a management consultant agreement. So how do you do that? Well, you may have a consulting agreement in place where you actually have a contract and you are being hired, to essentially work based on a discrete task. You're not going to, for example, be paid a salary. Instead, you can be paid based on measurable outcomes. So, by maybe you're going to produce a report. Maybe you are going to be billed by the number of hours you work. And that would be defined in the agreement between you and your employer. Again, this starts to look a lot more like an arrangement between a consultant and a company rather than as a full-time employee and a company. So, a pay arrangement that is not a salary and a contract showing, what the scope of work is, what the problem you're coming in to address is. All of that helps to strengthen a management consultant application. The other, oh, and you
Um,
see here, oh, go ahead, Jay.
yeah, so we have two very quick questions regarding the management consultant category that maybe it is a good timing to kind of, go over, right? So let's start with the first question. So someone asked, if my university degree is in financial management and I have an MBA, can I apply in the category of management consultant?
Yes, you can. So when you look at the qualifications, imagine that they are or statements. So if we look at the regulations, let's look at management consultant. What it says is baccalaureate or licenciatura degree. Okay, so that's one way you can qualify is by having a degree. So if you have an MBA, a master's in business administration would satisfy the degree requirement. So even though this says baccalaureate, which is a bachelor's, a master's is fine, a PhD is fine. So yes, you would qualify based on the degree. If we keep reading, or equivalent professional experience. So if you're applying based on professional experience, you can completely ignore the degree requirement. Just you don't have to think about it at all. You're applying based on experience, and you would frame your application that way, that, I have 5 years of experience, and you would show letters from your past employers that actually are signed by the past employers talking about your experience and saying that you have 5 years of experience. So the short answer to your question is yes, you can satisfy that requirement based on your degree.
Thank you, Dustin. So one other question regarding the management consultant category. So does it matter the size of the firm that is wanting to hire you? So what if a new and small consulting firm is hiring you via TN? Is that okay?
Yes, it is okay, but you want to anticipate it in your application. So basically, anticipate that the border officer, or if you're applying at a consulate, the consular officer, they might ask. They might ask you, how long has the company existed? How many employees do they have? And so it is helpful sometimes to contextualize who the employer is. And a good place to do this is in the employer's letter where they're describing the challenge they're facing. So, you know, they can talk about how they were founded, in 2022. They have X number of clients. Talk about what the need is. Now, the question is, a consulting firm has hired you. So again, if you're a management consultant coming to work for a consulting firm, that is less risky by definition, because you're not coming to work for a company that's not a consulting firm. But to answer your question, yes, you can come to work for a smaller consulting firm. You do want to make sure to show, really in any category, not just consulting firms, that the company can pay you. So that is a question sometimes that the border officer or the consular officer will ask is, how is this company going to pay you a salary of $130,000 if they're a small company and their revenues were low? So be prepared to answer that question. But the answer is yes, you can be hired by a new company to work for them. Now, one other thing I did quickly want to add is, when we're talking about the management consultant category, let's just actually read what the qualification is. So we talked about degree or equivalent professional experience as established by a statement or professional credential attesting to 5 years experience as a management consultant, or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. So just to be very clear, it is this final part of the qualifications that I was referring to with the solar panel company, is that you would say, I have 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement, because the consulting agreement is about solar panels. I have 5 years of experience in solar panels. So you'd be applying based on that. If you do have 5 years of experience as a management consultant, that would be your category for qualifying. And if you have a degree that's related to business, that could be, or management, that could be how you qualify. But you only need to qualify based on one of the options. If you're applying based on a degree, you don't have to worry about the experience to satisfy the qualification requirement. Now, that being said, in the letter that the employer writes, it can be very helpful for them to explain how you're coming to address a problem. And not only do you have, say, a degree that's relevant, but you also have experience. In the letter, that's where they would really want to frame you as the ideal candidate for the job. But that is separate for the qualification, which is a threshold requirement to get you kind of in the door. To address the qualification requirement, you only need to show that you meet one of the options.
Okay, thank you, Dustin. Let's move on.
So the second challenging category is the economist category, and it's challenging for very different reasons from the management consulting category. Namely, in 2017, the government put out a memo that basically narrowed the scope of who can enter the US in the TN economist category. And basically what that memo said was, basically, the government has been allowing people to come in the economist category when really what they're doing is working as market research analysts. So they're working in marketing, or they're working as financial analysts. And what's helpful is to go on Occupational Outlook Handbook to really see what these jobs do. But if you do take the time to look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook, you'll see that basically what financial analysts do is they advise companies that invest clients' money to increase profits. So they may be engaged in stock trading or investments, and financial analysts are looking for opportunities to strategically invest money to increase profits. Market research analysts are kind of working, as the name suggests, in marketing. They're helping companies to find opportunities to market their goods or services. So basically, this memo specifically said, if you're working as a financial analyst or a market research analyst, if you're performing those job duties as they're defined in the Occupational Outlook Handbook, you cannot come into the US in the TN economist category. So what can you come in the TN economist category to do? Again, I'm going to just Google economist OOH, Occupational Outlook Handbook, and I'm going to click that link, what they do. If you're coming into the US to work as an economist in the TN category, you need to show how your job duties will have you, and I'm reading from the Occupational Outlook Handbook now because that is what the border official or the consular officer will do. You need to be coming to research economic issues. Okay, you need to be conducting surveys, collecting data, analyzing data using mathematical models, statistical tools, and other software, interpret and forecast trends such as of financial markets. You need to be advising your employer on problems that are related to fiscal policy or other economic topics, and you need to be presenting your research to management, to decision makers at the company. And you can continue reading on the Occupational Outlook Handbook. It's actually very helpful, the job duties that they list. And what's important to keep in mind is it's not a matter of copying and pasting these job duties. It is a matter of having a discussion with your employer, and this is something we do if a client wants us to engage with the employer. If the employer hires us, we'll have a discussion with them, helping them figure out how to align the job duties with those that are in the Occupational Outlook Handbook, so that the border official or the consular officer, when they read what the applicant will be doing at the US company, it really does sound aligned with what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says this person should be doing as an economist. And it's not a matter of doing all of these. What it is a matter of their primary duties being those that are listed in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So again, if a minority of your job duties, say 20%, are outside of what's listed on the Occupational Outlook Handbook, that's oftentimes okay. It's just that most of your job duties, most of your time really does need to be spent doing the job duties listed on the OOH, the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So, we really do find that those who are applying in the management consulting category or the economist category, those applications really do benefit from a lawyer being involved and really advising on them, potentially helping to draft the employer letter and working with the employer on that. So, if you are looking at one of those two categories, do, be very thoughtful, consider hiring an attorney, especially for those categories. So let's talk a little bit more about the TN application process. I've already talked about most of this, so this will be fairly quick. Canadians can apply at a port of entry or at a consulate. Now, the application packet, what does it consist of? Oftentimes, the most important part of the application packet is a letter from the US employer. And what this letter is it is basically laying out who the employer is, who the applicant is, meaning the employee, how long they're going to be working in the role, what profession they'll be working in, what their job duties will be, again, consistent with the OOH, how long they'll be in the US doing this work, usually anywhere from 1 to 3 years, how much they'll be paid. Again, there's no requirement that they be paid above minimum wage, but if the salary is unusually lower than what's paid to someone in the profession, it can be a flag, and you might get questions about that. So ideally, you will be paid what's normal for the profession. And really explicitly asking that the government approve the application. That's what the employer letter will contain. The employer letter should be printed on the employer's official letterhead. And the letterhead should have the contact information for the company, phone number, address, email address. It should also have the original signature of the person who's in charge of hiring, whether that's the supervisor, whether that's the human resources manager, the CEO. It needs to have an original signature. Many ports of entry, many border officials will reject an application that is not original. Will reject an employer letter that is not original. So it's just worth going in with the original version and not risking that. And the reason is border officers do encounter a good amount of fraud, so they're sensitive to copies. In addition to the employer letter, you obviously need to have your passport. You also need to have original documentation showing that you meet the qualifications. So if you're applying based on a diploma, you need to actually bring your original diploma. One quick note that I didn't talk about before is if you're applying for a job and qualifying based on a degree, your degree really does need to be clearly related to the profession. So if you're applying as an accountant, you need a degree in accounting. If you're applying as an economist, you need a degree in economics. There is some leeway here where if you are, say you're applying as an accountant, but you have a degree in finance, that's probably not going to be a problem. Let's say you're applying though with a degree in mathematics. You start to get a little farther from accounting. If you're applying based on a degree in statistics, a little farther from accounting. So it is doable. But if you start to have a degree that is a little more distant from your profession, what we would usually do is recommend that you bring your original transcript and actually go through your transcript and highlight in the employer letter what classes you took that are related to accounting. So for example, if your major was in statistics, but you took a lot of classes in accounting, maybe you wrote your thesis on accounting, something like that. Then in the employer letter, they can talk about that, and they would talk about that in the section that's about you as an employee. They talk about how you have a degree in statistics, but you did significant coursework in accounting. You wrote your thesis on a subject related to accounting. So, advocate for yourself, or the employer should advocate for you in the letter if your degree, is not so closely related. But the general rule is your degree should be very closely related to the profession. If you're applying, if you do end up bringing your transcript to the interview or to the border, try to bring the original transcript. So any document showing how you qualify really should be originals. Finally, experience letters. We talked about management consulting, how you need to prove you have at least 5 years of experience. That is usually done by having letters from past employers talking about how you worked for them for 5 years. And you can piece together several. So if you worked for 2 employers, one for 2 years, one for 3 years, you can bring those 2 and show you how you have 5 years of experience. But those should have the original signatures on them. And again, ideally have them printed on official letterhead from the person who's signing the letters. Nationals of Mexico must apply at a consulate. To apply at a consulate, the first step is to file a DS-160 online form. They would pay the visa application fee. They'd schedule their biometrics, fingerprints, schedule an appointment, and attend their interview. They would bring to their interview at the consulate pretty much the same application packet that a national of Canada would bring to theirs. So everything I said before, proof that you qualify, the employer letter, all originals. The national of Mexico would bring the same thing to their consular interview. And again, Mexican nationals might receive a streamlined process, but that's up to the consulate. Nationals in Mexico and Canada can apply from within the US through USCIS. They would do that by filing a Form I-129 with the USCIS with supporting documents. The supporting documents are the same as what I outlined before. However, they can be and should be copies. So USCIS does accept copies. You should, unless the application specifically asks for it, you don't need to send originals. Now, one quick caveat is, we talked before about sponsorship. If you are applying at a consulate or at a port of entry, you as the employee are the applicant. So if your application's denied, then that denial is on you as the employee applicant. It's different when you're applying through USCIS. An application through USCIS is actually signed and submitted by the employer. So that denial would be the employer's denial. Now, sometimes employers are a little nervous about an application submitted in their name, but again, it does not actually create any additional obligations on the employer. Certainly none of the sponsorship requirements that we talked about before. It really is the employer saying that they have honestly completed the application. They sincerely intend to employ this person, for a set amount of time at a certain pay rate. But again, if it doesn't work out, if, the employer gets fired, if the employee quits, that's okay. This is at-will employment, whether it's the application's filed with USCIS or not. And a few quick tips. It's always helpful to call the port of entry ahead if you're a national of Canada, to just ask them what the procedures are, if they're going to be open at the time you plan to arrive. It is a best practice to tell your employer when you plan to actually be at the consulate or at the port of entry, because sometimes government officials will actually call the person who signed the employer letter just to get them on the phone and make sure that the offer is legitimate. So, do give your employer a heads up about when you plan to be at the port of entry or at the consulate. As I mentioned before, bring the original diploma, official transcripts, and original signed versions of the employer letter if they're relevant, right? If you're applying on experience, it would just be the employer letter. If you're applying based just on your degree, it would be the diploma and the transcripts if they're relevant. Do bring original signatures. Just assume that the officer is going to want them. You don't want to be turned back at the last minute just because of that. The TN visa is a non-immigrant visa, so you do need to show non-immigrant intent, meaning you're not intending to adjust status and basically become a permanent resident. So this is usually a quite low bar. A lot of people are worried about this, but usually, if you can show that you have some ties to Canada or Mexico, that could be that you have a bank account there. It could be that you have a home there, you have an apartment there, whatever it is. You have ties to Mexico or Canada. That's usually sufficient. This question usually doesn't come up though until you've renewed your TN visa a couple times at least, and you can renew your TN visa. I didn't mention that before, but it can be renewed indefinitely as long as you remain eligible. Caveat being that management consultant applicants, they do face a higher risk as they renew it because that's supposed to be a discrete role if they're working for a company. If they're coming to the US to work for a management consulting company where they're providing services to other clients through the consulting firm, that doesn't apply. You can renew your TN visa to do that. Again, that's not a risk considered a risky category. All right. I believe, is that the end of it, GA? And we'll turn to questions?
Yeah, we do have a lot of questions that rolled up, so maybe we can quickly go through them.
Sure.
We have 7 more minutes. So
Yep.
the first one, someone has completed their master's in pharmacy, but they are working as a cloud developer. How would one go about applying for a TN?
Well, the first step is to figure out what you want to do in the US. So, if you want to come to the US to work as a cloud developer, you would have to go to the TN regulations. And really, I'll just walk you through what you would do. You would pull up the NAFTA regulations, just Google NAFTA TN regulations, and you would look at the job titles that are relevant to your field. So just off the top of my head, if you're working in cloud development, could be computer systems analyst, could be an engineer, which can include software engineer. You'd look at those categories and you would go on the Occupational Outlook Handbook and see if the job duties that you intend to do in the US are aligned with what the government thinks those professions do. You would also, as a preliminary step, need to make sure that you qualify. So to come as an engineer, you do need a bachelor's degree or a state or provincial license in engineering. If you're coming as a computer systems analyst, you do need a bachelor's degree or a post-secondary diploma or certificate and 3 years of experience. So, if you don't have those qualifications, you unfortunately cannot apply. You would be denied.
And those degrees should be related to computer systems analysts if you are using that category. And so even if you have a degree in pharmacy, you can't really use that to support the cloud developer position, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Pharmacy is just too far removed. The government's going to say it's just not related.
Okay, I can get the next one. So TN non-immigrant visa versus EB2 national interest waiver self-petitioning. So it really depends, the choice between an NIW and a TN, it really depends on your plans on what you want to do in the United States. So let's say you are Canadian and you just want to come in and work like 1 year for a US company and then come back to Canada. In that case, a TN is the most straightforward way. Now, if you want to eventually be a permanent resident of the United States, then an NIW is definitely something you can explore. Note, however, that there is a backlog right now in that category, and it could take more time to get the immigrant visa or adjust status to EB2. So the timing could also be an issue if you want to start working in the US pretty soon after. And the TN could be a much quicker option in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next one. If someone's TN visa is expired, but the I-94 is valid for a longer time, can I travel abroad to Mexico and re-enter the United States?
I would say no. And the reason is there's a difference between your I-94 and the visa. The visa gives you the ability to re-enter the US. The I-94 does not. There are some exceptions. But for all practical purposes, I would say be very careful and assume that you need to have a valid visa to re-enter the US. So if your visa is expired and you want to travel, I would say apply to renew the visa at the consulate in Mexico before you try to re-enter the US.
Great. What about the category of telecommunications project manager? I got a degree in engineering and electronics, and I have 8 years of experience as telecommunications project manager. Is there a category for this?
So, we typically would recommend to schedule a consultation if you have questions specific to your background. But on your own, even before a consultation, if you'd like, look at the regulations, think about what you'd actually be doing in that job, and see if there is a profession that seems to fit that category. Telecommunications project manager, think management consultant, think it could be computer systems analyst. Just look at what the job duties are and figure out if there's an alignment, and then see if you meet the qualifications. And that's how you'd want to approach that.
Definitely a consultation would be good here. So if any of these questions are also related to factual questions, definitely schedule a consultation with us. So I'll just go through maybe just some more general questions then. Degree evaluation. Are degree evaluations necessary? And is there a list of companies that are accepted by CBP if you need one?
Great question. So degree evaluations are not necessary if your degree was issued in the US, Canada, or Mexico. But if your degree was issued outside of those three countries, for example, London School of Economics, Oxford, you do need a degree evaluation. In terms of companies, we don't recommend any in particular. So I would just go online, see what the reviews say, and find the company that you're comfortable with.
All right. How much time does somebody have to leave the country when they lose their job? So let's say the I-94 is still valid. If they lose their job, do they need to leave immediately, or is there a grace period?
Yeah, there is a grace period. GA, help me remember. I think it's 60 days.
I think it's 60 days. I agree.
Yeah, I think it's 60 days, though. Don't quote me on that. I do. The reason I'm a little hesitant is that there actually was recent guidance on this after the recent wave of layoffs, especially in the tech industry. The USCIS actually issued guidance saying, that you have a certain period of time, I believe it's 60 days, that, and again, that is assuming your I-94 is valid. You do have to leave by the time your I-94 expires if it's shorter than 60 days. So be careful of that. Look at your I-94. But one of the other interesting things in that guidance was that USCIS made it clear that you actually can look for another job in that period. And that had been a little ambiguous before, but USCIS actually said, if you're laid off and you want to have discussions with another prospective employer about getting another TN and maybe filing an extension of status, of TN status with a new employer, you can do that. So that's helpful to know.
Right. So here we did have that question. So yes, if a company offers you a job and you are in a different status, you can certainly apply through USCIS to change your status to TN, or you can leave the US to apply a new visa at a US consulate if you want. So both are options for you. You don't have to choose one or the other. Okay, so it is possible to change status of TN visa to H-1B. Yes, that is possible. Can it be inside the US or does it need to be outside? So you can do a change of status inside or get a visa outside. And the length of the process, it depends on whether your employer is using premium processing or not. Okay, what else do we have? TN must cross the border with me. Oh, this is a good question. With a TN, if I have a TN, does my family must cross the border with me at the same time, or could they cross the border later with me? So TN1, so I believe that's Canadian, right?
Yeah, I mean they can cross at a later time. Again, assuming that they are nationals of Canada. If they're not, they'd have to apply at a consulate and have the visa. But it sounds like the son is a full-time student, may have a student visa because he's going to age out as a dependent. So he can certainly travel on his own.
All right. So I think that's pretty much it. So any fact specific questions, definitely reach out to us for a consultation. And yeah, I think there is also another simple one we can answer. How many years can TN be renewed? There is no
Yeah.
limit on how many years. However, depending on the category, if you renew for too many times, your non-immigrant intent could be questioned.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think we can get through these pretty quickly. So,
Okay, sure.
is a banker eligible for a TN visa? Look at the job duties on OOH under economist, and which seems to me to be the closest related to banker. If your job duties align with the economist category, then you may apply as an economist. But if not, it's going to be a tough sell. If my TN was canceled, can I reapply? Not sure what you mean by canceled, which causes me a little
Right.
concern. So if your TN was canceled because of misrepresentation, something like that, you may not be able to reapply. But by and large, if your TN was denied, you apply and they just decide you don't meet the criteria. By and large, yes, you can reapply, and it's not a problem. You just want to make sure your application is strong when you reapply. Um, is it more difficult to change to TN status within the US than outside? I wouldn't say it's necessarily more difficult. It really depends on what profession you're applying through. Some ports of entry are more difficult than others. Sometimes USCIS is more difficult. It's really specific to the profession that you're applying for. You will get access to the recording. We'll send you that after the presentation. And yeah, we're not going to get into do you qualify under certain categories. Go ahead and schedule a consultation if you'd like to discuss that. Would a cédula profesional suffice? So a licenciatura degree is usually what's required, but you may end up needing to have an equivalency to just be sure that what you have is considered sufficient for the category. So I'm not able to say some schools have different degrees, and we'd really just have to take a look and see if it satisfies the requirement.
All right, so I believe that is all. Thank you, Dustin, so much for the very informative presentation. I'm sure it was helpful for everyone. And thank you, everyone, for being so responsive and engaged. It was very interesting. So, okay, well, then, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for
Thank you
joining
so
us.
much. Thanks.